He would be the last man anyone in Red Hollow expected to interfere, and yet he would be the one to take her away before winter fell, the one who would stand between her and the only life she had ever known. But on that morning, Clara Mae did not know this, did not know that rescue could wear a weathered hat and speak in a voice barely louder than wind through dry grass. She only knew that she was 20 years old and still waking to the same sound that had ruled her since childhood, the heavy tread of her father's boots crossing the warped wooden floor before dawn. And she did not remember a time before fear, because fear had been the first thing she learned to swallow, to tuck beneath her tongue the way other daughters tucked secrets. And in the narrow farmhouse at the edge of Red Hollow where the fields stretched wide but offered no escape, her father's temper set the rhythm of the days, rising with the sun and breaking like a storm without warning. And Clara moved through the morning chores already braced for impact, hands raw from hauling water, shoulders aching from splitting kindling, knowing that punishment did not require reason, only proximity. And Thomas Hale believed that discipline was proof of authority, believed that control was the same thing as strength. And when the coffee was too weak or the eggs too firm or the barn door left swinging an inch too wide, his silence would grow thick and dangerous. And Clara had learned that the quiet was worse than shouting, because shouting at least arrived honestly. But quiet stretched thin and sharp before it snapped, and the belt hung coiled on the nail beside the pantry like a promise that never needed repeating. And she had long ago trained herself not to cry because tears fed something in him she did not understand. So she folded inward instead, eyes lowered, breath shallow, making herself smaller in hopes of being missed. But she was never missed, and the town knew, because bruises bloom in colors that no long sleeve can fully hide, and because pain carries across open land if the wind is right. Yet Red Hollow had perfected the art of looking away, neighbors tipping their hats at the market, offering polite smiles that stopped short of questions. Survival in small towns often depending on silence. And Clara would stand in line for flour with her gaze fixed on the floorboards while whispers drifted above her like smoke. And she told herself that this was simply how her life would be, that 20 years could pass, and then 30, and then 50, and nothing would change because nothing ever had. Until the afternoon the sky pressed low and heavy, and she dropped a wooden crate near the barn, the crack echoing sharper than she intended. And her father's shadow stretched long across the dirt as he stepped from the doorway, his jaw already set, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the way her body prepared itself before her mind could. And somewhere beyond the fence line a horse slowed its pace, its rider turning his head at the sound, though she did not see him yet, did not know his name was Elijah Boone, or that he had come to Red Hollow the previous spring with little more than a herd of cattle and a past no one dared question. A man who kept mostly to himself, who spoke rarely in town and paid in exact change, whose eyes carried a distance that suggested he had buried more than livestock. And when her father's hand seized her arm, and the first strike came not from the belt but from the back of his hand, the force knocking her to her knees in the dust, the world narrowed as it always did to the ground beneath her, and the taste of iron at the back of her throat. And she told herself to stay quiet, to endure, because endurance was the only skill she had perfected. And her father's voice rose, accusing, condemning, words spilling not because of the crate, but because anger required an outlet. And the second blow was already forming when another sound cut through the air, the slow crunch of boots on gravel beyond the gate, deliberate, unhurried. And her father paused not out of mercy but irritation at the interruption. And Clara kept her head lowered because hope was a dangerous thing, and she had learned not to reach for it. Yet the presence lingered, solid and unmoving. And though she could not see him, she felt the shift in the air, the way tension recalibrated when someone else witnessed what was meant to stay hidden. And Thomas Hale straightened, squaring his shoulders as though authority could be restored by posture alone. And Clara's heart pounded not from the pain but from the unfamiliar weight of being seen, because whoever stood beyond that gate would have to decide whether to follow the town's unspoken rule of silence or break it. And she had never known anyone to choose differently, never known anyone willing to trade comfort for confrontation. And so she braced herself for the familiar retreat, the polite nod, the turning away. But the footsteps did not fade. They drew closer, steady as a drumbeat, and the air felt charged in a way she could not name. And though fear still coiled tight in her ribs, something else flickered beneath it. Something fragile and nearly unrecognizable. And she hated herself for feeling it, because hope had always carried a cost. And the dust clung to her palms as she pushed herself upright just enough to breathe. Not daring to look up, yet sensing that whatever happened next would carve a line between the life she had survived and something she could not yet imagine, and a cross. The field, the cattle shifted restless, and the wind moved through the dry grass in a low murmur. And for the first time in 20 years the pattern of her suffering hesitated, balanced on the edge of interruption, waiting to see whether this day would end like all the others, or whether the quiet cowboy at the gate would choose to step forward. He did step forward, and the moment he did the air shifted, tightening in the yard like a storm about to break, and Clara felt it even before she lifted her eyes from the dirt, because her father's grip on her arm faltered just slightly, not loosening, but no longer absolute. And when she finally looked up, she saw the cowboy from town standing just inside the gate, hat low, shoulders squared, his expression unreadable, but his presence steady as bedrock. And Elijah Boone did not shout, did not rush, did not flare with anger the way other men might have. He simply walked closer until the space between them demanded acknowledgement, and Thomas Hale straightened, jaw set hard, demanding to know what business brought him there. But Elijah's voice came low and even. "That's enough," he said, and the quiet certainty in those words carried more weight than fury ever could. And Clara's heart pounded because she had never heard anyone speak to her father that way and live comfortably afterward. And her father barked a laugh, calling it a family matter, warning the cowboy to turn around and ride back to his precious cattle. But Elijah did not rise to the insult. He only glanced at Clara's swelling cheek and the way she knelt half-curled, as if bracing for another strike. And something hardened in his gaze, though his tone did not change. "She's 20, he said evenly. "That's not discipline." And the wind dragged across the fields, carrying the distant creak of doors where neighbors pretended not to watch, and Thomas tightened his hold on Clara's arm as if to prove ownership, and Elijah's eyes dropped briefly to that hand before returning to her father's face, calm and unyielding. And there was no rage there, only stillness, and stillness unsettled man who relied on noise to dominate. And her father stepped closer, chest to chest, threatening, posturing, but Elijah did not retreat. And Clara realized he was not measuring strength. He was measuring resolve, and resolve does not need to raise its voice. And then Elijah reached into his coat and unfolded papers creased from preparation, explaining he had spoken to the sheriff, that employment terms were drawn, that Clara had every legal right to leave, and the mention of law cooled Thomas more effectively than any threat could have, because anger thrives in shadow but weakens under witness. And Clara sensed movement beyond the fence line, figures pausing, curiosity sharpening the edges of the moment, and her father's bluster lost its certainty as he scanned the document, scoffing yet no longer entirely sure, accusing Elijah of trying to steal what was his. And the word has struck Clara deeper than any blow, because she understood then how she had always been seen. And Elijah answered simply, "She's not yours to break. No drama, no challenge, just fact." And the yard held its breath as Thomas weighed pride against consequence. And finally his grip fell away from her arm with a sharp shove, muttering that she would fail, that she would crawl back when the world proved harsher than he had been. But his voice lacked conviction now, and Clara remained kneeling even after he released her, because freedom felt like a trick. And Elijah crouched in front of her, removing his hat, careful not to touch her without permission. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly, and those words trembled through her more violently than any strike, because choice was something she had never been offered, and she searched his face for cruelty disguised as kindness, but found only patience. And the silence stretched long enough for doubt to whisper. Yet behind her she felt her father's anger simmering without power, and ahead of her stood a man who had stepped forward without spectacle. And slowly she placed her trembling hand in his, and his grip was firm but gentle, lifting her to her feet without claiming her. And when she stood, the yard seemed wider somehow, less suffocating, and Elijah turned toward the gate as if the matter were already settled, and Clara followed, half expecting to be dragged back. But no hand seized her, no shout split the air, only the low murmur of wind through dry grass and the steady presence of the quiet cowboy beside her. And with each step away from the farmhouse, the invisible tether stretched thinner, fear still clinging to her skin, yet something new moving beneath it, fragile and unfamiliar. The first thin thread of freedom pulling her forward into a life she had never known. The ranch beyond Willow Ridge was quieter than any place Clara had ever known, but it was a different kind of quiet than the farmhouse she had left behind. This silence did not wait for anger to ignite. It simply existed, wide and open beneath endless sky. And in the first days she moved through it cautiously, expecting kindness to expire, expecting rules to tighten into punishment, yet none came, only steady work, meals left on the table without demand, and a small room with a window that faced grazing cattle instead of a locked door. And Elijah Boone did not crowd her healing, did not ask for gratitude. He showed her how to saddle properly, how to mend fence wire without tearing her palms, how to correct mistakes with patience rather than shame. And the first time she dropped a bucket and braced for impact, he only picked it up and said, "It happens." And the simplicity of that mercy unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. Because cruelty was predictable, but gentleness required trust, and trust grows slowly in soil long trampled. Yet days became weeks, and no blow followed error. No raised voice shattered dusk, and Clara began to sleep through the night, at first in fragments, and then fully, her body gradually unlearning the habit of flinching at every sound. And one evening, as autumn light spilled gold across the pasture, she found Elijah sitting on the porch, hat resting beside him, staring toward the horizon as if measuring something only he could see. And she asked him why he had taken her, why he had stepped into trouble that was not his. And he was quiet for a long moment before answering that he had once failed to protect the people he loved, and would not fail again if given the chance. And there was no hero's pride in his voice, only honesty shaped by loss. And Clara understood then that rescue is not always loud or triumphant. Sometimes it is stubborn and steady and willing to stand where others turn away. And as winter settled over the ranch and snow lined the fences in white, she realized that what he had given her was not just distance from harm, but space to become someone beyond it. And though the scars remained, fate reminders beneath her sleeves, they no longer defined the shape of her days. And one morning she stepped outside before sunrise and felt the cold air fill her lungs without fear following it. And in that stillness, she recognized something new and unshakable. She was not her father's anger, not a possession to be corrected, not a life meant to be endured in silence. She was simply Clara, 20 years old, standing in open land with the freedom to choose her next step. And that freedom, quiet and steady as the man who had offered it, was stronger than anything she had left behind.